Good evening, wherever you are. My name is George Drummond. I'm a member of the AIIC Legal Interpreting Committee, and it's my great pleasure and privilege indeed to welcome you to today's online forum on training court interpreters in languages of lesser diffusion. The AIIC Legal Interpreting Committee engages in dialogue with users of court and legal professional interpretation services, such as legislators, courts, judges, and we cooperate with other professional associations and provide interpreters at national and international courts with a platform for networking and learning. The committee has 4 active members: Christian Driesen, our coordinator, Veronica Perez-Guarnieri, Katerina Apostolaki, and myself, and we are supported by corresponding members. The committee has been organizing regular training events and information seminars for many years in Europe and in the Americas, and in view of travel restrictions since the pandemic, we have gone online. This forum is the 6th online forum in a series starting in 2021 with the Inter-American Human Rights System, the most recent being held in October 2023 on the African Court on Human and People's Rights. Our forum today concerns training court interpreters in languages of lesser diffusion and is organized in cooperation with SYDISE, the Hellenic Association of Conference Interpreters. Katerina will guide us through the program today.
George. Now, a few points of housekeeping. The event is being recorded, so please keep it in mind. Anything that is said will remain on record. I would like to start by saying that we're very grateful to our interpreters, Rachel Brevière and Smitha Chakravarti, for volunteering today, and you'll be able to listen in by using the interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen. You'll see it's a globe, and you can choose your language, either English or French for the day. Now, AIIC's Legal Interpreting Committee has joined force with SYDISE's Legal Interpreting Committee for this event. For those who don't know SYDISE, it is the Greek Association of Conference Interpreters, and in order to facilitate clients who need conference interpreters for arbitrations and other legal work, we have a special registry with those interpreters who attended CPD on interpreting in legal settings. Now, in a recent event on the use of our mother tongue, Nicola Canestrini, a criminal lawyer, evoked the often forgotten importance of emotion in proceedings. Often, when a trial hangs in a balance, it is the speaker's remorse and outwardly expressed feelings that can tip the scale, something that is very difficult to do when you don't have a good command of the language. This makes interpreting a key element in justice, especially in languages that are not widespread in a given context. But how do we go about training interpreters so they're up to this difficult task? Christian Driesen will set the scene by giving us an overview of the training in languages of lesser diffusion, the historical background and training methods. Now, I would like to present Christian a bit. For those of you who don't know her, she is the convener of the AIIC Committee for Court and Legal Interpreting, and she is a professor, a legal interpreter, conference interpreter, of course, also, and she has had the scientific direction of several training programs for legal interpreters and international communication for lawyers. She was former EULITA Vice President and the convener of the EULITA Advisory Committee for Research and Training. Of course, whatever we say about Christiane, it's not enough to convey the warmth of Christiane. She is an amazing personality to work for and with. She gives people amazing opportunities to learn to find their voice. And she does that both for students and for people who work with her in other capacities. Christiane, it is a very great honor and pleasure to hand it over to you in order to hear you speak about this very interesting matter.
Bonjour, good afternoon. Good afternoon. I am extremely pleased and privileged to be able to speak in French thanks to our colleague interpreters, Rachel and Smitha, and I thank them. And I hope that I will not cause too many problems for them with this presentation. Thank you very much to Katharina as well for this very warm introduction, and thank you to all of my colleagues from the committee who have been involved in organizing this forum. Let me now share my screen so that you can see my presentation. So my slides will be in English. I didn't really take the trouble to translate them into French, but I'm rather going to speak very freely. And I'm going to talk to you about training legal interpreters and translators for languages of lesser diffusion. And I'm going to talk about courtroom with interpreters and with judges, and I'm also going to try and present the challenges that come up when it comes to training interpreters in languages of lesser diffusion, and what are the requirements for a fair trial. And to do this, I'm going to talk to you about this method that we call the tandem method, which takes direct inspiration from a long-standing method that was launched by Danica Salaskovic. I'll go back to that in a minute. Now, what are the main challenges for training interpreters in languages of lesser diffusion? And some of these challenges actually come with the definition itself of what a language of lesser diffusion is. Some people talk about rare languages. However, rare languages in some countries, for instance, Chinese in some countries could be a rare language. In Hamburg, where I am right now, Chinese is a rare language, and this would be ridiculous. Arabic is also a rare language where I am right now. So what we could say that languages of lesser diffusion are languages that is rather not very widely diffused in a specific geographical area. So let's say, let's imagine that in Vienna, the Czech language is a widely diffused language, whereas in Hamburg, the Czech language will be a language that is of lesser diffusion, because few people understand and speak it. And one of the main challenges with these kinds of languages is that there's a lot of variation, because at some times there might be people that might be coming in from one particular area of the world, and this influx can constantly vary. And so this depends on migratory flows, and all of this can be very quickly changing as well. And of course, the conventional universities, in all of their methods and principles, are also not in a position to solve these problems, because universities tend to appoint a chair of such and such a language, and one cannot ask of them overnight to create a chair of a language such as Tagalog or Twi, etc. So you have to find other solutions. Another major problem is that many of these languages of lesser diffusion do not exist in written form. And in many of these languages, the legal terminology has not yet been firmly established. The legal notions are not very well established, especially if these languages are from countries that have achieved independence recently, and so their legal systems tend to be very deeply disrupted and therefore they might not have the legal terminology that is required. And so in light of all of these challenges, well, the fact is that we have very few trainers that can rise up to all of these challenges, and that are capable of holding a good command of all of these languages of lesser diffusion, and who also have a good command on legal terminology, and who are also aware and have command over interpretation techniques. And so we had to find a solution to establish training programs to respond to these very specific needs. Now, what you see here is a courtroom. So you can see that we have a sign language interpreter who is interpreting for a witness. In some of the training workshops that I conducted, this was in Germany, we had sign language interpreters who were trained to work for the courts specifically. And so they had to understand and learn and adapt their interpretation techniques to the courtroom setting. So this is a small aside, just to illustrate that the fact that all of these languages of lesser diffusion are all themselves very different from each other. And so we also have to keep in mind that we have to teach or train the trainees for all of the interpretation techniques in order to guarantee a fair trial. So the idea is to provide the speaker or the witness with the same rights as the persons, individuals who might have a good command of the languages of the court. It is, of course, unacceptable to compromise on the quality of interpretation. This in light of the principles of human rights, the very principle of human rights. You can simply have a look at the UN Declaration or the European Convention and Directive, and there are also other similar conventions on all other continents as well. And we also have the 2010-64 EU Directive, which also defines the principles of respecting human rights, i.e. rights of the linguistic rights before national and international jurisdictions. And as is the case for international jurisdictions, we must strive to stay in the Nuremberg tradition where all of the bits, the defendants and the other parties, be interpreted in their entirety. So I say all of this in light of the fact that we cannot compromise on the quality of interpretation. And here you see a picture of the Nuremberg trials where the interpreters were interpreting everything that was said during the trial, albeit in very uncomfortable settings. And so basically we're talking about training trainees for all techniques, i.e. sight translation, simultaneous with text, consecutive, simultaneous as well as whispering, an awareness as well as to the various sociocultural differences, knowledge on legal and judicial aspects. And what I find particularly important, because this is the basis for everything, is a sense, a very specific sense of professional ethics. And this is something that you will hear about again when you hear the presentation on the ICC. So now let me move on to the tandem method. So this was a method that was developed by Danica Seleskovic in the 1950s. So Seleskovic was a major figure in interpretation and theory of interpretation. And during the Suez Canal crisis, she launched training. Well, there were not enough interpreters who had good command over interpretation techniques in the Arabic language. So in France, you had these very well-read erudites who had a very good command on the Arabic language, but who weren't able to master the techniques of, who hadn't yet mastered the techniques of conference interpretation. And so, in a very quick time, Selaskovic had to improvise and develop this training method. And she called this method régimes spéciaux, special regimes in English. And she applied this same method at AIIC for other languages, for other colleagues like Marianne Lederer, Carla Desjans, who also went on to train interpreters in Thailand. And so in each case, languages of lesser diffusion were used for these kinds of trainings. And there was another colleague who worked with Korean, French, and English. And this colleague went on to be the director of the interpretation school in Seoul later on. And in all of these occasions, well, there was no other choice than to use the tandem method because there were no other Korean interpreters in Paris at that point in time. And then this method was adopted and adapted by the SKIC, the Conference Interpretation Services of the European Union, especially for the new member countries for whose languages we didn't have too many interpreters back when the enlargement took place. And so this method was used first in the context of workshops, and this enabled us to train an entire generation of interpreters. George Drummond, in fact, who spoke at the beginning of this forum, took part in one of these training workshops for Finnish and other languages for which we did not have interpreter colleagues. And then we realized that there was a real interest in training interpreters for languages of lesser diffusion in the national courts. And this is what we were able to launch, set up in the University of Hamburg. And I then went to Magdeburg, where I was professor as well, and we were able to also launch this training then. And then we launched the same training program at AIIC and in AIIC as part of a continuous training program. Now, what do we expect of the candidates? In all of these training programs, especially for continuous training programs, there is first and foremost a test to ensure that they have good mastery of the languages in question. We also required a degree, a bachelor or a master's degree, or a validation of equivalence of their competencies acquired elsewhere. And the training programs themselves were either remote or in-person trainings. So the program was designed to cover roughly 100 hours in presence, and all candidates and participants were expected to commit to at least 300 hours of self-study work. And this entire program is regulated by the ISO standard. And in addition to the interpretation techniques modules, we have modules such as intercultural communication, legal proceedings, legal translation, and interpretation. And so this here is a small group of participants that are participating in front of the booths, and because this is part of the in-person training.
When it comes to trainers, what we expect from interpreter trainers is the command of language, not necessarily of the language that is being taught. We ask of those trainers to be practicing interpreters, respecting professional ethics. We also require them to be able to train in the different interpreting techniques, and if possible, we like them to be specialized in legal language. It's a very scarce profile to find. Here you have an interpreter working for the police. If we look at traditional training institutes or universities, they are very much focused on the language rather than on the interpreting techniques. And if we look at the environment surrounding languages of lesser diffusion, we find it difficult to train people to keep up with the changes on the market, and hence we really need to be able to put the emphasis on teaching interpreting techniques. We therefore train interpreting techniques in a common language, the local language. If I'm teaching in Germany, the lingua franca will be German. In French, in France, it will be French. So a common language in multilingual groups. The trainer starts by teaching the principles of interpreting techniques, and then will work in tandem, hand in hand, with a linguistic expert, highly qualified linguist, an academic, not necessarily an interpreter, not necessarily a translator, but someone who will be qualified to check the accuracy and the quality of the interpretation. And this qualified linguist will provide feedback in tandem with the interpreter trainer, the interpreter trainer being in charge of checking the interpreting techniques. We also call on the participation of other professionals, experts, lawyers, doctors, police officers, so that we know what their needs are. The tandem method relies on 3 steps. First, the monolingual teaching of interpreting techniques. And when it comes to exercises, the participants with the same language will provide feedback to their colleague in a peer review. Then we have bilingual exercises with both trainers, with the tandem of trainers. And the third step is relying on internet platforms to work from home, platforms such as Zoom or others, to be able to record oneself for consecutive interpreting, for example. We ask training interpreters to keep a recording and to also keep a recording of their notes, the consecutive notes, so that we can provide advice when we see that a mistake has been done in the consecutive interpreting because of inadequate note-taking, for example. So what are the advantages of this tandem teaching method? We can quickly adapt to demand and hence react quickly to new migration streams. We also, we have noticed the high quality and the convenience, the practical relevance of the work thanks to the central role of this duo of trainers. And the guiding principle itself is an advantage, which is contributing to the respect of fundamental rights. I thank you for your attention. Did you know that parrots were the symbol of interpreters for Egyptians? So I leave you on that.
Thank you, Christiane. That was an absolutely amazing presentation. I'm absolutely in awe of this system that you've created, or that you have actually perfected over the years. I know that you attributed its creation to somebody else, and I know that George was also instrumental. So he'll be able to help us in the third section today to have a better understanding of how it works out and works in general. So I think this will allow us to go on to the next session. And I would like, in order to present Annie this to read out a bit from her CV, because I think it will help us understand how she has a really good feeling for all of this, as she has worked long and hard in this direction. She has started her career as a staff interpreter at the European Commission, and she worked for several years in Milan as a freelance before accepting the post of court interpreter in the French booth at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And there she was also put in charge of training simultaneous interpreters in situation languages for various trials. And I think she's going to explain what a situation language is. Now she works as a freelance interpreter in The Hague, and she continues with her training activities at the ICC. She is the chair of the Netherlands and a member of the Interpreters in Conflict Zones. And I think what is pertinent today is that she also gives a course in interpretation at the Université de Lettres et de Philosophie over Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium. She's going to talk to us about training interpreters in languages of lesser diffusion at the ICC, a subject matter she knows very well indeed, and it's a great pleasure to hand over to her. Thank you, Annie, we're all ears.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes?
We can indeed.
Okay. So let me just get organized with my slides. Yes. Je vais m'exprimer en français.
I will switch to French and follow the example set by Christiane.
J'ai perdu, excusez-moi, j'ai perdu les images.
Just looking for my presentation. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon, even remotely. I will speak French, but my slides are in English, just like Christiane's. I tend to be a fast speaker for interpreters, so please forgive me. And if really it's too fast, please let me know in the chat. I thank Katarina and the SYDISE for their invitation to talk about a topic that is very close to my heart and that I've been working on for a number of years now. I'd like to say from the beginning that what I say, I voice my personal views. Everything I say is not necessarily the official view of the ICC, an institution of which I am no longer a permanent interpreter. I will talk about my personal experience as a trainer, and I will share with you lessons learned from my work as a conference interpreter, court interpreter, and trainer. Also, the title announced for my presentation, I'd like to say a word about it. I will talk about training court interpreters, simultaneous interpreters in the courtroom. The ICC also relies on a lot of field interpreters or operational interpreters, so interpreters that do not work simultaneously in the courtroom, even though they may sometimes carry out consecutive interpretation in a courtroom. So I'm here to talk about the way we train court interpreters working simultaneously in the booth, in the courtroom, with our French booth, English booth colleagues during the whole length of a given trial. The one difference between these situation languages interpreters and French and English booth interpreters, and maybe Alfred can give us his opinion on that later on. So the one difference is that if you work in the French booth or in the English booth, usually we only work into our A language, into our mother tongue, whereas our situation languages colleagues will work both ways, situation language to either French or English, and retour. Just a few words now about the languages used at the ICC in The Hague. I will then talk about the main principles of the training we provide at the ICC, a short tailor-made training, and then I will give you an example, an illustration of a training that I organized, an actually booth. I will tell you later on what actually is for a trial that took place at the ICC, the Ongwen trial. The ICC works with the United Nations official languages, English, Arabic, Chinese, Spanish, French, and Russian. Since most international courts set up after the Second World War, the ICC really has two working languages, English and French, which means that all proceedings have to legally be conducted in both these official languages, whatever the languages used in the countries of which come people that are on trial. Article 50 of the Rome Statute, the founding text for the ICC, it stipulates that if a state party to proceedings or a state allowed to take part in proceedings, the court will allow the use by the court of a language different from English or French if deemed necessary. And this is why currently there's a situation in a Latin American country, and the hearings pertaining to that country use Spanish on top of English and French. So I've told you about situation languages. What do we mean when we talk about a situation at the ICC? A situation is a number of crimes carried out on a given territory, in a given country. The country or the territory can be a single country, several countries, in which the ICC carries out investigation. Following a situation, we may have or not open a file with charges to feed one or several trials. To come back to the title of my presentation, situation languages at the ICC, for which we have had to train interpreters for court hearings, are always languages of lesser diffusion. And what do we deem languages of lesser diffusions at the ICC? We mean by that languages for which we have no trained conference interpreters.
Do you think you are sharing your slides?
And the next one. Voilà, stop. Alors, comment se déroule la formation? La formation.
So now, how does the training take place? So the training takes place in the premises of the court. So there is a training room with 2 interpretation booths. And the training takes place at the same time as the court works according to its normal routine, with other trials happening, with various actors coming in, prosecutors, witnesses, lawyers, etc. And all of them come into the court and are exercising their professions in the court, and they can in fact potentially be contributors to this training program, and I'll come back to that later. And this training is also a personalized training, a tailor-made training, because this can respond to very specific needs at a particular time with a very specific budget, also limited in time, and responding to the conditions imposed by the court or by the chamber, and with limited material and human resources, as well as keeping in mind the judicial constraints and the budgetary constraints as well. And it is a pre-trial chamber that decides whether or not there should be simultaneous interpretation training. And so this order is given to the clerks, the officials that are in charge of languages. And then this order moves on to the linguistics section, who then publishes a job vacancy, and then they organize a selection of candidates to this particular training program, and then they bring them to The Hague, and they need to obtain visas, and they also need to obtain leave from their respective jobs in their home countries, etc. So after all of this has happened, we roughly have about a little less than 1 year to begin the actual training itself. One more detail, we're not looking here to train conference interpreters here, rather we're looking to train competent interpreters as stipulated by the Article 67F that I spoke about earlier, for a particular situation, for a particular specific trial, or several trials if one situation gives rise to several or one or more trials. And so we're really looking at a very sort of targeted training program that responds to a very specific need. And in order for this training program to be successful and to give us the results that we expect, we need to make sure that the candidates are very carefully selected beforehand. Christian earlier was talking about this test that they organized at the court. At the ICC, our tests are not a small test. It's a very, very rigorous admission test, and I'll get back to that later on. So we select potential candidates for the training program, and these candidates, once they're recruited after the test, they're recruited as civil servants, as staff of the court. They are given an office, they have access to the intranet of the court, and they're completely integrated into the institution as civil servants, as staff members of the court. So I was saying that the training takes place inside the premises of the court, and this training program also actually depends on those that work in the court regularly. And this is a huge advantage, obviously, because the interpreter trainees are immediately immersed in the context, in the legal context. They're in daily contact with their colleagues who are already in the booths. They are able to attend court trials. They have access to courtroom hearing transcriptions, etc. And they can also, for instance, listen to live broadcasts of their interpreter colleagues who are already in booths, who work in booths in the morning, and who come actually conduct specific modules of training in the afternoon. And so this entire environment, training environment, is rather conducive to this training. And the fact that this training is conducted inside the institution does also present a few inconveniences, of which the leading one is that the trials take priority over the training, and so very often the trainers don't have the time or the capacity to come conduct their training sessions, and so very quickly the candidates have to learn to work by themselves, and they must become autonomous when it comes to their training. I told you I was going to talk to you about an example of a specific training program. And so let me now talk to you about how the AIIC booth training took place in 2016. If we can go to the next slide, or go a bit further on the slides, that would be helpful. Perfect, this is perfect. Just a bit further down, please. Okay. Is this slide number 11? Yes, that's perfect. So this training program was launched in 2016. I was given the task of setting this up. Let me start by talking to you about recruitment. And there's also one slide in fact, that focuses entirely on recruitment. Yes, that's the one. Very good, thank you. So here you can see the criteria for selection at the ICC. I'm not going to go with the first few criteria because these are all very obvious criteria. Let me just go directly to one criterion that I think is essential, that is very dear to me, and which we call in specialized literature the teachability. This is a terminology that is used by Robin Sutton, a university trainer. So when we talk about teachability, we're talking about the capacity of the candidates to listen to and to take into account the criticisms and the feedback that is given to the individual during the training program. Obviously, all of the other criteria are also essential, but given that this training program happens over a very short period of time, if this particular aptitude is absent in the individual, then it will not be possible to obtain the results that we want from this kind of training program. As I was saying earlier, moreover, interpreters of the situational language systematically work into the working language of the court, i.e. French or English, and this could probably be qualified as their B language. And because you're all here interpreters yourselves, you all know that working into your B language requires constant and systematic efforts to develop your B language. And Acholi speakers, for instance, worked from Acholi into English. And in this case, the Acholi was considered as their A language, even if in Uganda and elsewhere in Africa, things are much more complicated, but that's a whole other subject. I realize, in fact, that I didn't talk to you about what exactly Acholi is. So Acholi is a language that is spoken in the Acholi territory in the north of Uganda. Acholi was also the language of the accused in this particular trial, and this was the reason why we needed this particular booth during the trial. So the training program is developed on 4 different pillars that are worked on simultaneously. So first and foremost, we're working on acquiring the interpretation techniques. So we're talking about consecutive, simultaneous, side translation, simultaneous with text, etc. I think we can move on to the next slide, slide 12. Here you have the order of the court authorities that determine the interpretation, the mode of interpretation. And then the second pillar focuses on general knowledge, understanding the proceedings of the court, how the court functions, getting familiar with the legal texts of the court, with the international criminal courts as well, the ICTR, ICTY, the Special Chamber for Cambodia, etc., and all of the case laws for other international jurisdictions, which are very often cited in the proceedings. And of course, the candidates also need to get familiar with human rights and texts and proceedings related to human rights, gain awareness on the NGOs that work in this field, such as Amnesty International, etc., what they do. And of course, candidates also have to work on the languages themselves, the working languages of the court, work on the various registers of the language to be able to work in the courtroom, because obviously in this kind of setting you have to respect a certain kind of register, and you also have to pay attention to the pronunciation in order to be fairly articulate. And the candidates are also required to develop terminology of the court, And all of this is, of course, possible in just 22 weeks. This is what we had in order to train interpreters for this particular trial. And this is only possible if the interpreter trainees are able to put in a huge amount of personal and collective work. So now let me move on to the general principles of the method. And as I said earlier, it was an immersive approach. So they're fully immersed in the court and its various actors. And then we had a weekly training. And each week, there were 3 objectives that were determined and 1 theme that was outlined. And here, could I ask a colleague who's handling the slides to show the Word document with the work program? So when I spoke about the theme that was determined for each week, which was one of the themes, let me give you an example of the themes that we dealt with, sexism, and this unfortunately was a topic that was recurrent in many of the proceedings of the court, and so we needed to describe with very accurate and precise terminology in both languages what had happened in a particular situation for us to be able to establish a crime. And we were also expected to talk about very sensitive topics, and so it was necessary to practice this vocabulary, appropriate this vocabulary, and also be able to actually express these ideas and these terms without any personal hindrances or worries. And so all of these aspects are developed simultaneously over the course of this training program. I wanted to show you the document with the work program. So we teach the interpretation techniques by exploiting, by building on the various themes that are chosen. We ask the trainees to make presentations on these various themes. So these presentations help them acquire knowledge, help them refine and also enrich their means of expression, and also build on their public speaking abilities. And of course, these presentations are also used to develop interpretation techniques. In the first week, we start with consecutive and gradually move on to simultaneous, although we do come back regularly to consecutive in order to consolidate the décalage and the slight distance that you have to maintain, etc. And we also build on what literature terms peer learning. So the trainees have to really appropriate this training program. They have to be able to move forward as a team. They have to work together because they're going to work as a team over the course of the entire trial. And they also have to acquire a certain amount of autonomy when it comes to learning. And another thing that I think is very important, yes, that's it,
the next point, which I find
is a constant reflection that is required by the trainees, as well as the coordinator and the trainers,
to keep track of progress, but also of difficulties week after week. We can take a look at this first assessment, for example. Over the 22 weeks of training, every Monday morning, every week, we had a meeting, a debrief where we looked at what was done in the previous week, what difficulties came up, what progress were made, what worked, what didn't work. And the coordinator, myself, in that occasion, used this debriefing meeting to adapt the work of the following week, to try and design a tailor-made progress approach to help the trainees make progress. We wanted to encourage from the very beginning those trainees, make them autonomous, empower them in their training, get them to think every day about what was working and what was not working. The next important point, we taught those training interpreters to look after themselves, pace their effort, take the necessary distance with the content of what they were interpreting, be able to assess one's unease, one physical state, possibly sometimes call upon outside support, call upon the psychologists in charge of people working at the AIIC. Then we also had a module on using the voice. We called upon a phonic expert working with comedians, actors, because if you want to interpret in the long term, you need to be able to use your voice wisely to protect your voice. We have, as I was saying, a training room with 2 booths that are open all the time for the trainees. They can go there whenever they want. Also, we had a number of folders that were helping the trainers follow the training program. If we take the week from the 8th to the 12th of August, for example, I said back to consecutive, for example. After having tried simultaneous, we went back to consec, and you see in the second columns the exercises for the given week. So working on the links, logical links, on tenses, working on the capacity to address an audience. You also see, this is something I haven't mentioned yet, on the column at the far right, you see the guest speakers. We mean that by that speakers that we systematically invite to come and talk about the topics that are used daily at the court, topics that interpreters need to understand to do their job. For example, here you have in that specific week, we called upon an associate psychologist from the victims and witness section. She came to address the trainees, talk to them about her work, what she does. And of course, we used her presentation for our trainees to practice interpreting consecutive and simultaneous. We also use the speeches given by the guest speakers to work on the term, on being aware of one's state, to realize when it's too much, when you're too tired, to know when to stop. We also used the speech to work on the terminology. We invited Gabriela, the terminology expert, to come and explain to the trainees the work she was doing and how she was putting together the terminology. If you want to scroll down, we also had to work on the ethics. Christian mentioned ethic earlier on. Of course, we have to constantly bear in mind how important it is to work in an ethic way at the court. And we invited the head of the linguistic section of the court. He came to talk about questions relating to ethics. I would like now to react to what Christian said about the tandem training methodology and the fact that she called upon a linguistic expert to provide a tandem with a conference interpreter. This is what we did at the very beginning of our training at the AIIC. Alfred will remember we had a tango linguist expert that came at the very beginning. Unfortunately, we no longer call upon linguistic experts at the court. and hence we can only rely on the trainees themselves for providing the material in the situation language, to have material to work on, which is one of the shortcomings of this training method.
Alors, je crois que je vous ai presque tout dit.
I think I've
Je vais terminer en
more or less said
donnant
everything I wanted to share with you. Let me end
les difficultés
by
qui
sharing
concernent
with
les
you
difficultés
the specific
formation.
difficulties that we met with in that training.
L'extrême brièveté
First,
de
the very
cette
short
formation.
time we had to provide
Lorsque j'ai
training.
fermé cette cabine autonomie,
When we trained for the Acholi booth, the colleagues were recruited at the beginning of the summer. They arrived in The Hague at the very end of July, beginning of August. We started training end of July. The trial was due to start on the 6th of December of that year, so we had 22 weeks available for training these interpreters, which is not very long.
Le fait que les formateurs
Then
sont aussi,
the
les
trainers
cours, sont
are
aussi les
the court interpreters or people working in the courtroom. They're not available full-time for the training. We had a roster just like any other day in the booth as English or French booth interpreters. So we could only provide the training when we were free. We were not always available, which explains why we need trainees to become autonomous as soon as possible. Then it was difficult to find material, to find content in Acholi, written texts. Very few newspapers are written in Acholi. There are a few broadcasts available. So the trainees had to bring their own material. They had to bring texts or speeches, and this was difficult for them. Another difficulty that we may discuss later on during our webinar is I want to talk about how difficult it is to strike the right balance between interpreting per se and working as a cultural mediator. I think this is the case whatever the languages, but made only more acute when the two languages come from very different cultural backgrounds, which is the case between languages of lesser diffusion and official languages at the court. So when is the interpreter in charge of explaining what this is all about? When is it to the party to ask more questions or to ask for clarification? When is it the role of the interpreter to make the audience know that a term needs clarification? It's very difficult to strike the right balance. And you really need to have far-reaching interpreting experience to know when you need to intervene or when a specific term will need to be clarified or explained. There's no recipe from that point of view, knowing when to intervene. Another difficulty in that training is that the AIIC, for budgetary reasons, the court only recruits the exact number of interpreters needed for a booth. A booth at the AIIC is made up of 4 interpreters. So for each situation language, we recruit 4 trainees, 4 learning interpreters. We call them para-professional interpreters. So we recruit 4, we need all 4 to succeed, which is not always a given. So there's a lot of pressure on the coordinator and on the trainees the learning interpreters this need, this obligation to succeed. I think I'll stop here because I could go on and on about those training courses that are absolutely fascinating, but time is of the essence. Let me end by saying, and I think Alfred will support me in saying this training within the court is very demanding, very interesting, but very difficult, requiring a lot of work, a lot of efforts on the part of the trainer, the coordinator, and on the part of the trainees. And this is all the more so because of the short time we have to provide the training, and in the view of the huge expectations of the court. Those court interpreters will then be very important during the trial because the witnesses interpreted by those court interpreters provide proof and evidence in the trial. So we're expecting near perfect work from those interpreters who have had very short time to be trained. Sorry about the technical hiccup in the middle of my presentation, and thanks for your attention. Sorry again, thank you.
Annie, thank you so much. Absolutely no problem with the technical problems and difficulties.
Sorry, there is a question. We will answer questions at the end, but there is interest in your presentation. Could you share that later with the participants? We can send them if you agree, okay?
I will review it first, and then yes,
yes, great.
Will
Thank
send
you.
something. I wouldn't send it as it is right now.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So as I was saying, there's absolutely no problem with the small and minor setbacks. I think the information you gave us was truly very interesting indeed. We understand what a huge effort and colossal work is undertaken both by the coordinator of the training and by the trained interpreters. So thank you, Annie, this was truly an amazing job. And I will, without further ado, go on to the next section because we will have the possibility for Q&A afterwards. And I'd like to say it's a great pleasure to launch a new format for our online forum and welcome Alfred Goma-Balou in discussion with the AIIC member, that's the Legal Interpreting Committee member, George Drummond, and who are going to give us a different perspective, and that is from the side of the interpreter who has gone through the training to become an interpreter in Sango this time, and who went on then to become a trainer and examiner for future colleagues. Alfred has been recruited by the ICC in 2010 and worked as a paraprofessional interpreter, the term used before by Annie and that you all heard, in Sango, the national and official language of the Central African Republic, on the Bemba case. In 2021, he was promoted to associate Sango interpreter and assists in the training and end of training assessment of new recruits for his booth. Thank you both. We look forward to listening from you.
Thank you so much, Katarina. Now, we've heard so much theory from the very beginnings when Danica Seleskovic embarked on this project to create a special regime for the training interpreters in the tandem method. Christiane has highlighted the problems of training interpreters in what we call languages of lesser diffusion, mainly for interpreters working at national courts. We've heard from Annie about this very specific training course using several working languages, which are required by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And now we have the absolute pleasure and thrill to welcome our old friend, Alfred Goma-Balou. Alfred, you are in the unique position. We've been talking about the theory so far, but you have actually gone through this training course. You know the training course better than anyone else from a completely different perspective. And this is what we are interested in now. So, Alfred, welcome and thank you so much for taking part in what is going to be a very informal conversation between the two of us, and whoever wants to listen in can listen in. I'm sure that this will give rise to a lot of questions afterwards. Alfred, my first question to you is about the language that you were working with. Sango. It's a language spoken by nearly 1.6 million people in the Central African Republic and the neighboring countries. Was this your first language?
Déjà, merci à tout le monde. Merci
Thank
pour,
you, everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity again to talk about the work I do at the AIIC. To answer your question, George, I would say that Sango is indeed my mother tongue. Just one point of clarification, Sango is spoken by at least 6 million people, 6 million people. According to the last survey, there are 6 million people living in the Republic, Central African Republic. And if we look at neighboring countries, we can assess the number of speakers at more than 6 million.
And this is something that in our context, in the European context, and in the context of the AIIC, we refer to as a language of lesser diffusion. I mean, spoken by 6 million people. It's absolutely incredible, absolutely incredible. Alfred, you were recruited by the AIIC in 2010. Can you tell us a bit about the recruitment process from your point of view? Annie has talked about the recruitment process from the point of view of the court, but you, as an applicant, how did it start? Was there an admission test? How did you go about it?
Oui, effectivement, j'ai fait acte de candidature.
Yes, indeed. I first sent an application to the court. When they called for application in 2008, there were several ways to apply. There was one team working in the field, raising awareness, asking competent people to send an application. I applied online. And then in 2010, I was called first for an interview. Then I came to the court for a test. And at the end of this test, I was recruited to enter the training program.
The training program has been outlined by Annie. You know, she said this is a training program where we try to bring people up to speed in a very short time, 22 weeks. You have to learn the interpreting techniques, you have to learn legal terminology, you have to learn how to work in the court, you have to learn the whole system. What were your challenges starting this training program?
Déjà, le tout premier défi.
I mean, the first challenge was terminology, legal terminology, because we come from different backgrounds. And when we looked at the requirement, people with legal training or basic linguistic training. I'm a linguist by training. So for me, the main challenge was acquiring the legal speech.
Qui attendait qui était déterminante dans l'issue de la formation, était déterminante pour le début du procès. Donc ça, c'était un deuxième.
And so the training, the beginning of the trial was dependent on the success of this training program, and so that was a huge challenge. And then thirdly, I come from a poor country, and so the results of this training was going to have an impact on my entire career. And it was a huge privilege to work in an international organization. And so this was also a huge challenge for us.
But let's take a little step backwards. You were talking about learning, or the challenges of learning the the technical terminology, the legal terminology, the terminology of the court. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that a lot of legal terminology exists already in the Sango language. Where were your sources? Where did you get the legal terminology in Sango from?
Oui, déjà, la cour, c'est une cour internationale.
Yes. So the court is an international court, and so the judicial system itself is very different from what we have back home. And so there were no corresponding legal texts, and so we had to work on terminology, and that was indeed a huge job. This was done during the training session, at the same time as working on other terminology as well in the Songo language. And we were also working on phrasing of the courtroom, phrases that were going to be used in the courtroom. So this was simultaneously worked upon during the training program. And
avec la terminologie, la section l'unité de terminologie.
we did this hand in hand with the terminology section at the court because there was a similar work done for Lingala, so there was similar terminology, and we therefore had to have the same language and same terminology in the Sango language as well. And so we were able to establish this terminology for Sango. And this was a huge element of pride for me because I contributed to this.
Interpreter. I mean, that is an enormous task. This brings me to another point that Annie mentioned, peer learning. I understand that in the Sango booth, you were a small number of trainees. Did you work together on terminology on this? And the second part of the question is, did you have access to other Sango speakers, perhaps at the court, who were lawyers or legal experts, not interpreters, who were able to assist you in the work of terminology?
Non, absolument. Nous n'avons pas eu de locuteurs.
No, absolutely not. We did not have outside speakers or other speakers of Songo. We did have an expert who worked in the CNRS, a research institute in France, who worked in tandem with Annie and with other instructors who worked on our training program. And so he came in as a speaker in Songo, but when it comes to other experts, lawyers, etc., we didn't actually find any Songo speakers among these actors. And so basically, a huge chunk of the work was done by us and by the expert who was in charge of assisting the instructor in this training program.
The work that you've done is now part of the library of the ICC that other people will have access to.
Absolument.
Yeah. Another point which interests me, because this is something that I encountered when some years ago I was with Christiane at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and we were working on a project to train interpreters in Kinyarwanda with very similar problems to the challenges that you've just outlined. And one thing that struck us in particular were the intercultural issues. We experienced with some of our trainees that they had difficulty in expressing certain situations in French or in English because of the cultural background. And there was one young woman in particular who said, look, in my culture, women don't talk about these things. Or in my culture, I'm not expected to speak in public. These are cultural issues that for us Europeans are very difficult to understand. But have you encountered these intercultural problems in your work as well?
Absolument. Je dirais même que C'est notre quotidien.
Yes, absolutely. I think I would even say that it's a daily challenge. Every day, every time there is a court hearing, there's a proceeding, we encounter this kind of challenge, these intercultural challenges. In some languages, there are a few taboos as well. And so you have to actually overcome these taboos, especially when it comes to talking about subjects such as rape. In my language, for instance, we don't talk about rape. We do not name the intimate parts. We don't talk about vaginas and penises. And so we need to overcome these taboos and be able to talk about them. And on the linguistic level, there's also lots of things that are typical of Central African Republic nationals. There are some things that can only be understood by the nationals of the CAR. For instance, there's a particular occasion where family members come together before a particular wedding. And this is something that we call the mortuary place in our language. And this is an example that we actually spoke about. And so we had to come up with a way of expressing this with the English booth to be able to express this idea. And so all of this to say that interculturality is a daily challenge. This is also something that applies to the proverbs and the sayings that we have in our language. We need to be able to express them.
Has been pioneering and will inspire and help other people to benefit from your experience. Changing the subject slightly, can you describe to us, after your training period, can you describe your first interpreting assignment?
Oui, je m'en souviens comme si c'était hier. C'était un procès.
Yes, I can remember it as if it was yesterday. It was a very important trial. It was the Bemba trial. He was vice president. It was a very largely covered by the media. And I was supposed to open the trial. There were journalists. And I had to actually turn on my mic. And for about 10 minutes, roughly, I didn't speak to anyone. I was extremely nervous. And thankfully, for me, I was able to start off on the right foot. The first few sentences were very important. They in fact determined the rest of my career. I was able to get into the zone, as we say. And then I was actually able to have fun on the job. And I realized that it wasn't a huge burden. And the whole experience, in fact, inspired me to stay in this profession. And this was an unforgettable moment for me.
And I think a lot of us interpreters can share similar feelings. But, you know, you've gone on from there. You also work as a trainer of interpreters and an examiner at the court and their programs. When you're looking for candidates, what do you look for?
Je crois que, à mon avis, ce qu'on attend des candidats.
I think what we expect of candidates is first and foremost good command of their languages, of both languages. And there is the aptitude, the ability to talk about what was said in one language, one culture, into another language, another culture. And beyond all of this, of course, there is the ability to use your voice properly, the quality of your voice. Is it a pleasant voice to listen to? And this, of course, is a personal opinion. That, for me, is an important aspect. So mastery over the languages, fluidity in your expression, and there are other aspects too, but I think that these are the important criteria to apply. the ability to express something in a different language, and the quality of your voice itself. I think these are two important qualities.
Training experience, that the voice in particular was extremely important. And I used to say to my students, look, you have to put across a message and you have to be convincing. You have to speak in such a way and use your voice in such a way that the listener will accept your message. And I fully agree with you on that. I think that's extremely important in looking for candidates for interpreting programs. Now, we were talking about these languages, which we call languages of lesser diffusion. And Annie mentioned some of these in her presentation. Someone who has gone through the process, done the training, worked at the court, what are the employment prospects for interpreters using these languages?
Dans notre cas, nous avons eu beaucoup de chance.
In our case, we were extremely lucky because the Central African Republic was a country that was undergoing a crisis, and it was in fact under the United Nations, and after the 2012-2013 crisis, international organizations intervened in our country, and there was a huge need, a very huge need for interpreters, because many NGOs came to CAR who wanted to work directly with the population. And so they needed us to facilitate communication, and to this end, they needed interpreters. And so this training that I had at the court was a huge asset for me to continue working. And after our mission at the court, two of my colleagues continued to work at the United Nations, and this for several years until we were recruited in 2019. And so we had this opportunity, and so these opportunities continue to exist. And then there are lots of other nationals who are exiled in countries where they don't speak the languages. And so they too would call upon interpreters, and we would work remotely. I myself worked remotely with individuals who were exiled in Australia. And so we also had opportunities on that front. And so after your experience at the court, there are few opportunities. And I would even say that you can say goodbye once and for all to unemployment.
Known back then in 2010 what you know now, would you have embarked on this career? I think you've already answered that question, because we see from what you're saying and from your message and looking forward to the future that you're absolutely passionate about what you do and about encouraging people to embark on this, what all of us consider to be a wonderful profession. Finally, do you have any advice for young people who are considering taking part in the training course?
Oui, c'est le conseil que je ne donnerai pas seulement pour ceux qui veulent être interprètes.
So my advice is not just for people who want to become interpreters, but for everybody. I really think that you need to be completely involved and be entirely determined when you want to do something. And when you show determination and when you give yourself the means to achieve your ambition, well, you can. So I would only say the key word is determination.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that our colleagues listening to what we've been saying have lots and lots of questions. So I'm going now to hand back to Katerina, and we'll open some questions. But Alfred, thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you and wonderful to listen to what you have to say. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Georges, et le plaisir était pour moi.
Thank you very much, and the pleasure was all mine.
This new format was a great success. we learned a lot. And I was really inspired by those final words. Thank you, Alfred. Determination indeed. I mean, when I think of everything that you have to think about and the excellent concept of place mortuaire, and I'm certain that that puts quite a high bar of difficulty for our interpreters also. So thank you very much for giving us an insight into all of these matters. And actually, it is going to be our third person who will be coordinating, our third LIC member, who's going to be coordinating the Q&A, and that's Veronica Perez Guarnieri. So Veronica, I'll be handing over to you to take over this last bit.
Thank you, Katerina. Before we start with the questions, I think Christian wanted to say something. You wanted to take the floor, Christian?
Thank you very much, Veronica. I just wanted to reply to one remark made by Annie about informing the court or the partners in case of un malentendu, dans le cas d'un malentendu interculturel.
When it comes to intercultural misunderstanding, so the interpreters that we train can actually draw attention to sociocultural misunderstandings as soon as they see that there could be a potential problem. The interpreters try to raise awareness on the misunderstanding without actually intervening directly, and perhaps by interpreting literally, and hope that the listener who didn't understand can go back to the concept by asking a question. But this is not possible if the attention isn't drawn to this misunderstanding, and if this drawing attention is actually punishable, and in that case the interpreter is taught to say that the interpreter has a question for such and such a speaker. Will you allow for this question to be asked? To allow this initiative to be possible for the person who's leading the discussions. And if this permission is granted, the interpreter then is invited to ask a closed question so that the entire speech isn't repeated. And also the speakers are asked to respond as briefly as possible without any possibility for any kind of conversation to be possible between the interpreter and the speaker. And so there's a whole technique behind this that is taught to the interpreters in order to respect professional ethics, so that the interpreter doesn't get completely involved in the legal dialogue. This is something that I just simply wanted to put out there with regard to what was being said. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Annie, you wanted to respond to that.
Oui, oui, effectivement.
Yes, I fully agree with what Christian said. What we recommend is that that the interpreters begin to indicate that something might be wrong with the help of their voice, to draw the attention of the party that is asking the questions of the witness to the fact that this particular term or this particular expression can be problematic. And so to leave the ball in the questioning party's court, so to say, so that this party can come back to it and ask questions. But that sometimes isn't enough. And this was the case, for instance, for place mortuaire in French. And last week, in fact, there were a lot of discussions that the English booth was floundering for what exactly to say. and they were looking at the transcript and they weren't able to come up with the right term. And in fact, this is a small secret, there is a small WhatsApp group with interpreters working in the booth. And so in this case, we were able to send out a question and the Sango cabin, the booth was able to give us the answer. So basically what I'm trying to say is that with experience, the interpreters know that this particular problem is going to be problematic, and depending on the circumstances and depending on who is asking the question, where exactly the trial's at, etc., you can decide whether you can come in, you can intervene as an interpreter. It's actually quite delicate to come up with a fully fledged solution ourselves.
Okay, thank you very much. There are some questions on the chat. I know you answered them in writing, Annie, but I would like you to answer them orally too, in case there are people not reading the chat, because it's very valuable information. One of them is if these trainings are exclusively for Acholi interpreters or trainees. That's one question.
No, no, I probably didn't express myself clearly enough in my speech. These trainings are given for any language which is considered as necessary for the accused. So if we have a new accused at the court who speaks a language which is not a language, a working language of the court, that is English or French, and if this language doesn't have ready trained interpreters, then it is necessary to do a training to create a booth, literally, to have a booth in the language of the interpreters. So we've had Lingala, Alfred was mentioning Lingala, which is a language spoken in Democratic Republic of Congo. We've had Sango, we've had Acholi. I talked to you about Acholi, and other languages of lesser diffusion. So training is just when there are no ready-made, in between inverted commas, interpreters who could be ready to interpret simultaneously in the courtroom for the accused.
And how do you test teachability, and who are the researchers who worked on that teachability project?
Yeah, I gave two names in the chat. So one is Robin Seton, and the other one, Barbara Moser. There probably are others, but those are the two ones that I quoted. And how do you test that?
Yes.
Well, that's very difficult. But we usually have a long discussion with the candidates, asking various questions to see how they react, like what would you do in this situation or that situation, how would you react, to test whether they're going to be able, first of all, to work in a group, in a team, that they have enough of, they are capable of not putting themselves as the first person, but being in a group. And then also how they are able to listen to criticisms, how they're able to adapt their next answers, for example, to what we said after the first question. You understand what I mean? We ask a question and we expect maybe the candidate to react differently after the second question, having heard what we said in the first question. But it's if you do many tests, you learn how to recognize somebody who's going to be humble enough and aware enough to be able to be taught, and others who are too proud of themselves, in between inverted commas, and are not going to be able to be flexible enough to listen to criticism. It's quite obvious to me now who is. And of course, we don't succeed every time. Sometimes we think that somebody is appropriate and he isn't, or she isn't in the end.
And Adam wants to know if we can follow the training you were referring to, on the system terminology, how to access that. I think the question has to do with how to access that question, that training.
I don't really know. It's a training. It's a training only for future interpreters at the court. It's not a public training. It's not. That's what I said. It's a ready-made. It's really tailor-made training for interpreters who are going to work at the court, and the training is only for this particular trial, this particular language, in this particular setting. It's really very focused on this particular trial. So it's not a public training. It's not for everybody.
Mm. And Kathy Kaufman asks, how can the ICC training be adapted for use by national and local courts, where there are no booths, no preparation documents, and judges are often unfamiliar with how interpretation works?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Yes,
And that's something that has worried me for a long time now. This is something I would very much like to really transmit, to give to national tribunals, because I find that the conditions, the working conditions in national tribunals in general are so bad and so hard. And it's difficult at the court, but at least we have a booth, at least we have decent working conditions. I would very much like to be able to share that with national tribunals. I did once. I went to talk to a federation of police in United Kingdom, and I explained how interpretation works at the court. But I think it's something we should do more and more. Of course, it's a problem of means as well. It's a financial problem. Install booths and so on cost money. But I was told as well that it's a problem because the interpreters working in national tribunals do not know how to do simultaneous interpretations, so they are not particularly interested in developing that as well. So I don't know, that's a question. But indeed, it would be a good thing if we could expand our experience and share our experience with national tribunals and national judges.
A participant says that she's a Fulani and Wolof registered interpreter with the Supreme Court of Ohio, and asks if there is a need for those languages in Europe that you know of.
I'm sure there is, but I wouldn't, I'm not I'm not a recruiter of interpreters. I don't know, but I'm sure they could be, yes.
Je peux répondre à cette question.
I may answer that question. First, the trainings that I've talked about are aimed at national jurisdictions. We provided training at the Magdeburg University, trainings presenting all interpretation techniques leading to the certification of interpreters, and the ongoing certificate in Paris is precisely aimed at preparing court interpreters to work in their respective countries. Well, in France, because currently court interpreting in France is a disaster, to the contrary of Germany, where for a number of years now, the level required was higher. So there are trainings in place in France, And a training course can be organized thanks to professional interpreters in any given country. It so happens that the trainings are currently available in France and in Germany, but thanks to the association ULITA, to which AIIC belongs, founded by our commission, the LIC, research is ongoing to offer in court interpreter training for languages of lesser diffusion, training of all interpretation techniques, simultaneous whispering in accordance with the ISO standard. These training for court interpreters exist, and professionals such as us should really commit to provide such training to court interpreters. Second point, in Europe, Wolof and Fulani are languages that are often needed. For example, in Hamburg, in Germany, I was faced with that. But as the interpreter didn't speak German, we had to work from French into Wolof, Wolof into French, and then a relay from French to German, and remotely on Zoom. Thanks to the pandemic, interpreters not based in Sweden or in Germany or in any other European country could have access to interpreters in languages of lesser diffusions. And thanks to Relay, we could call upon these interpreters.
Thank you, Christian. We have two more questions. One from Sonia. She asked if the AIIC is building a corpus while training interpreters of languages of lesser diffusion. Because Alfred mentioned earlier that during his training, they worked on creating a sort of legal glossary in Sango language.
Je ne sais pas si, la
sorry.
question est, je ne sais pas si la question est destinée à Annie ou à moi.
I don't know whether the question is for Annie or myself.
I suppose it is for Annie, because the question is whether the AIIC is building a corpus, but then if you want to expand on it, Alfred, because you said that you are building a legal glossary, you are more than welcome to do it.
Oui, effectivement, il y a un excusez-moi, il y a un bulletin de terminologie existant déjà en
We
français.
currently have a glossary in French and in English, legal glossary. So we need a similar glossary in all situation languages. And this has been done. So a bulletin is published every time, updated. We also have the terminology in nearly all situation languages, and those terminologies are really connected to either the French or the English existing glossary. I don't know whether Annie would like to add. I was just saying that all languages used at the AIIC in a trial, all those languages of lesser diffusions, the Statute of Rome and all the legal documents of the courts have been translated. The statute has been translated in Acholi, in Songo, in Ingala, in Kinyarwanda. So all the legal texts of the AIIC have been translated in those languages. And as Alfred was saying, there's a terminology section at the AIIC recording all the terms. So every time the Sango booth, for example, creates or coins a term in Sango to translate a legal concept, it is recorded in that terminology, in a digital form, and I think it's accessible to everyone. So we are building up a corpus, and it's one of the tasks of those new trained interpreters to create a glossary, to compound a corpus. For example, I haven't talked about, because there are so many things I could have talked about, but everything pertaining to the participation of victims. At the ICC, the victims participate in the trial, and there's a very specific terminology used at the ICC pertaining to the participation of victims, and this terminology is available in all situation languages used at the court. A lot of work was done on Georgian, because at the time there was a situation in Georgia that didn't lead to trial, but for a number of years we had colleagues working on establishing a glossary in Georgian of all the terminology used at the ICC. I hope I've answered the question.
Thank you, Annie. We will take another 2 questions that are already in the chat, because we don't want to abuse the time of our speakers. So the first question is from Martin. He's asking, to my mind, a very pertinent question. What happens if halfway through the 20-week training, you discover that one or more candidates is not as teachable as you thought at the beginning? So do you have a plan B? Because that will mean a delay in the process.
Je répondrai que oui, c'est un problème. Que ça
it's clearly a problem when it happens. I mean, the training goes on regardless. I'm not quite sure how I should answer the question, because I'm not the one to decide what we should do with a candidate or trainee that is not performing as expected. What I can do is warn the head of the linguistics section and say that one of the trainees probably won't make it or won't be up to scratch to work in the booth, in the courtroom. That's all I can do. Then it is for the linguistic section, the head of the linguistic section, the head of interpreting, to decide on what should be done. What may happen is that the workload for the other interpreters of the group would be all the more heavier if you have one less interpreter, of one interpreter not being able to do all the types of work. It's a problem, but a problem that I don't have to solve, and it's really not my responsibility to decide.
Okay, and then there is a question about fees. We don't talk about fees for interpreters. Yes, we can ask the speakers whether they know if the fees are set by the court. Is the court that decides what is to be paid to the interpreters?
Je ne comprends pas très bien la question. Est-ce qu'il s'agit d'interprètes fonctionnaires ou
do you mean permanent staff interpreters or freelance interpreters?
It doesn't say. It doesn't say. I suppose freelance. Okay.
Donc pour les interprètes fonctionnaires,
for staff interpreters, the ICC follows the classification of the United Nations. So staff interpreters are paid according to their grade in the UN classification. For example, Alfred talked about paraprofessional interpreters, that's P1. When you are experienced, you may reach P3 or P4. For freelance interpreters, I can answer that at the ICC, we also have 2 categories of interpreters, court interpreters, simultaneous interpreters like Alfred and myself. And if you're recruited as a freelance, you have a rate for freelance interpreters negotiated by AIIC according to the UN class. And for field interpreters, the wages are different. They're treated differently. They're recruited as consultant and not short-term interpreters, which we are when we are freelance interpreters, and their wages are different, but that's a different question.
I don't see any further questions in the chat. Are there any final comments from the speakers?
Veronica, I think Alfred wanted to say something with respect
Okay,
to the
okay.
previous
I
question.
didn't
If we
see
can have one.
his hand. Yes, go
Yeah,
ahead,
thank you.
Alfred, please.
Oui, c'était à propos de la question concernant
I wanted to come in about the number of candidates and what happens if someone weren't so teachable. So in my experience, we were 6 of us to start the training session. And in the first module, which was on consecutive, there was an exam and 2 individuals were refused. And so they, after that, they worked as linguistic assistants. They didn't work in the booth, but rather worked as assistants. So it was a lower level of posting, so lower than P1, which was the post which was the grade given to booth interpreters. I don't know if I answered the question. Yes, I simply wanted to add that this was a case when Alfred was recruited, and it was decided, well, Court probably had more money then, and they had decided to recruit 6 individuals for a booth of 4 people. In fact, the last training that I conducted, we only recruited 4 people for a booth of 4 interpreters, and that in that case, this can be very problematic if one person were to fail or succeed moderately.
Annie, are ICC glossaries publicly available?
Oui, je pense que oui. Il faut aller sur le site de
Yes,
la...
I think they are. You simply have to go to the website, the ICC website. It's very easily available. I don't see why they wouldn't be publicly available.
Alfred says we were plan B in our case. They were worked as linguistic assistants. Okay. So, are there any last comments from our speakers, Christian, Katerina, Annie? Otherwise, before we conclude, and before I forget, we are recording in the original language and in English, and we will upload the recordings, but give us some time because we have to review the recordings. It will only be the presentations, not the Q&A that we will post. And we will let you know when that is ready. We will send an email to all participants. So before we conclude, a big thank you to our audience, speakers, the interpreters, especially Smitha and Rachel, and Maria for your technical support. Thank you very much. Your participation has made this seminar truly special. So we wish you continued success, and we look forward to connecting again soon.